The wind howled through the empty plains like a restless spirit, carrying with it the scent of sagebrush and distant campfires. The sun was dipping low, painting the horizon in streaks of blood red and gold. And the small wooden cabin at the edge of the valley looked more fragile than ever. Inside, a poor widow named Leora sat by the fading embers of her hearth, her hands trembling over a tin cup of water. The years had etched lines of hardship on her face, and the silence of her home was broken only by the creak of the floorboards and the occasional whistle of the wind outside. Life had been unkind, stripping her of everything she had loved, and tonight, for the first time in weeks, exhaustion claimed her completely. As Leora leaned against the rough wooden wall, she did not notice the figure approaching through the tall grass, his movements silent but deliberate. He was tall, with broad shoulders draped in a worn leather vest, his long dark hair catching the last rays of sunlight. His eyes, deep and unreadable, scanned the horizon as though he carried centuries of wisdom and sorrow all at once. He was an Apache warrior named Tokoda, a man whose presence alone seemed to command the plains. Stories whispered of his bravery, of how he could disappear in the desert wind and reappear when least expected. Yet tonight he came not as a warrior, but as a guardian, guided by some invisible force. Tokoda had been tracking the faint scent of smoke, the sign of life in a land that had grown indifferent to human suffering. The small cabin was a speck against the vast wilderness. Yet something about the woman inside stirred a curiosity in him that he could not ignore. He paused at the edge of the clearing, his keen eyes taking in the scene. A woman so fragile, yet her posture carried a quiet dignity. Leora stirred, half-conscious, her eyelids heavy, and in that instant, the world outside seemed to hold its breath. She had not expected anyone to come, not in this forgotten stretch of the frontier. The door creaked, and Tokoda stepped inside with the grace of a shadow, careful not to startle her. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice low, a mixture of concern and authority that seemed to echo against the wooden walls. Leora blinked, confusion clouding her features, but before she could answer, her fatigue overcame her. She slumped forward, and without thinking, Tokoda reached out, catching her gently on his shoulder. The warmth of his touch was foreign yet comforting, a stark contrast to the cold emptiness that had haunted her nights. As she drifted into sleep, she felt a strange sense of safety she had not known since her husband's passing. Tokoda carried her to a cot, his movements careful, almost reverent, as if the weight of her trust was something sacred.
Outside.
The wind continued its mournful song, and the shadows of the room stretched long, blending with the mystery of the night. In the morning, Leora would wake to a world forever changed, though she could not yet know it. Tokoda, though silent in the dim light, was a man of action, a protector shaped by the harsh lessons of the land. His eyes, dark as midnight, held secrets of battles fought and lives saved, yet tonight they softened as he watched over her fragile form. He had seen suffering, yes, but never had he encountered such quiet strength wrapped in vulnerability. Beyond the cabin, the plains stretched endless, dotted with rocky outcrops and hidden streams where deer grazed in the early light. Tokoda had come with no expectation of reward, no thought of gain. His motives were instinctive, guided by a code older than the towns and railroads creeping across the land. And yet there was something in Leora's presence that stirred a longing he had buried long ago, a whisper of connection, a spark that defied the distance between their worlds. She stirred slightly, murmuring in her sleep, and Tokoda's hand instinctively brushed a stray lock of hair from her face. There was tenderness in his gesture, careful and unspoken, as if the very act of touching her carried weight. Leora dreamed of open skies and rolling plains, her mind wandering to places she had only imagined in fleeting moments of hope. And in the silence between her breaths, Tokoda felt a promise, a fragile possibility that destiny had led him here for a reason. The night outside deepened, the moon rising pale and solemn, casting silver light across the cabin floor. Shadows danced across Tokoda's face, highlighting the scars of a life lived in the wilderness, a life of hardship and resilience. He had been many things: a hunter, a warrior, a wanderer among lands that offered little mercy. But in the quiet company of this woman, he sensed a chapter of his life waiting to be written, a story neither of them could yet understand. As the hours passed, a storm began to form on the horizon. the distant rumble of thunder a reminder that the world beyond the cabin was as unpredictable as it was dangerous. Leora slept on, unaware that the man at her side was more than just a stranger. He was a protector, a guide, and perhaps the harbinger of a life she could no longer imagine alone. Takoda's mind wandered to the possibilities. What if this encounter was more than chance? What if it was the beginning of a bond forged in trust, courage, in the wild heart of the land itself? In the early hours before dawn, as the first hints of light crept into the cabin, Tokoda remained vigilant. He knew the plains could be merciless, and danger often came when least expected. And yet, there was a flicker of hope that neither had yet dared to name, a hope that would soon challenge their understanding of fate, love, and survival. Outside, the storm neared, and the wind carried whispers of change, as though the land itself anticipated the collision of two lives that would alter everything. And then, just as the first drops of rain began to tap against the cabin roof, Leora shifted in her sleep, her fingers brushing Takoda's hand. He looked down, the quiet intensity of his gaze meeting hers even in the dim light, and for a fleeting moment, the world held still. In that heartbeat, possibilities stretched wide across the plains, and an unspoken promise lingered in the air, one that would test courage, heart, and the very spirit of the land. The storm outside was only the beginning, and neither Leora nor Takoda could yet imagine the journey that awaited them. But one thing was certain: nothing would ever be the same again. The rain fell harder now, hammering against the cabin roof like the heartbeat of the land itself. And Leora stirred awake, blinking against the dim light. Her eyes met Takoda's again, and in that silent exchange, the weight of the night pressed upon them both. She tried to rise, but her body protested, weak from days without proper rest or food. Takoda moved closer without a word, steadying her with a strength that was both comforting and overwhelming. "Sit," he said softly, his voice carrying an authority that brooked no argument yet wrapped around her like a warm cloak. Leora nodded, her lips trembling with a mix of fatigue and unspoken fear. She had never known a man like him, one who seemed at once fierce and gentle, a figure carved from the very wilderness around them. Takoda's presence was magnetic, and even as questions formed in her mind, she could not find the courage to speak them aloud. Outside, the storm raged with unrelenting force, turning the plains into a blur of rain and wind. The world beyond the cabin seemed hostile, dangerous, and indifferent to human life. Takoda kept watch, his senses sharp, ears attuned to the subtle shifts in the storm. His connection to the land was instinctive, honed over years of surviving in places where no one else dared to tread. He knew the signs of danger, from the faintest crack of a branch to the sudden silence of the creatures that shared his world. Yet something about this woman, her vulnerability wrapped in quiet courage, demanded a protection that went beyond instinct. Leora's mind wandered to her past, to the life she had led before sorrow hollowed her home. Her husband had been a kind man, but death had taken him too soon, leaving her alone in a world that seemed too vast, too indifferent to human longing. She had worked tirelessly, trying to keep her home, to feed herself, to endure. Yet the years of struggle had worn her down, and tonight, for the first time, she allowed herself to lean entirely on another. She did not yet understand the depth of trust she placed in Tokoda, nor the subtle shift in her heart that his presence inspired. Takoda, meanwhile, was studying her quietly. He had seen women before, had interacted with towns and travelers, yet Leora was different. She carried a quiet strength, a resilience forged in hardship, and a sadness that mirrored the emptiness he sometimes felt in his own soul. He wondered at the twists of fate that had brought them together, strangers bound by circumstance and the unpredictable cruelty of the frontier. His thoughts drifted to the stories his elders had told him, of women who carried secrets in their eyes and men who protected them not for glory, but for the promise of connection. Hours passed, and the storm began to ease, leaving the air thick with the scent of wet earth and pine. Leora and Takoda remained in silence, the quiet punctuated only by the occasional drip of water from the roof and the distant roll of thunder retreating into the mountains. She finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Who are you really? Why are you here?" Tokoda met her gaze, dark eyes steady. "I am someone who knows the land," he said simply. "Someone who understands that it can be cruel. I came because something told me you needed help." His words were honest, yet they carried the weight of mystery. He did not elaborate, and Leora did not press further, sensing that some truths were not yet ready to be revealed. As the morning light grew stronger, Tokoda stepped outside to check the perimeter. Leora watched him, noting the ease with which he moved through the rain-soaked earth, as if the wilderness itself recognized him as one of its own. She realized that in this man there was a story untold, a life that had seen more than any single person could endure. And though she knew nothing of his past, she felt the stirring of something she had not felt in years: hope. Tokoda returned, carrying a bundle of firewood to rebuild the hearth. He worked silently, the rhythm of his movements steady, almost meditative, and Leora found herself captivated. She had lived a life of necessity, her days consumed by survival, and yet, watching him, she glimpsed the possibility of something Mara life not dictated by loss, but by courage and companionship. The wind shifted again, carrying a faint scent unfamiliar to the plains. Tokoda paused, sniffing the air, his eyes narrowing. "We are not alone," he murmured, more to himself than to Leora. Her heart quickened, fear and curiosity intertwining. The plains were vast, but danger could come swiftly, whether in the form of outlaws, wild animals, or the unpredictable forces of nature. Tokoda's vigilance reminded her that survival was not merely a matter of strength, but of awareness, of trust, and of skill. Leora moved closer to him, drawn by instinct, seeking both reassurance and connection. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Tokoda looked down at her, the intensity in his gaze softened by a rare warmth. "We stay prepared," he said simply. "And we trust each other." Those words, so plain yet profound, settled over her like a blanket, offering a sense of stability she had long forgotten. As the day wore on, Tokoda shared fragments of his life. He spoke of the Apache way of survival, of respect for the land and the spirits that moved through it. Leora listened, fascinated by a world so different from her own, yet intimately tied to the earth she had always called home. She realized that the man beside her was not merely a protector. He was a bridge to a world of meaning, courage, and unexpected beauty. Yet even as they spoke, the air remained charged with tension. The storm had passed, but its aftermath left uncertainty in its wake. Tracks in the mud hinted at movement. Shadows in the trees suggested hidden eyes. Tokoda remained alert, his instincts sharp, and Leora sensed that the safety of this small cabin was fragile, as temporary as the light of dawn. She felt a shiver run through her, not from cold, but from the knowledge that life could change in an instant. In the quiet moments, Tokoda's gaze would meet hers, lingering just long enough to ignite a spark neither of them yet named. There was a connection forming, subtle yet undeniable. A bond born of circumstance and the shared recognition of vulnerability. Leora found herself drawn to him, not merely for protection, but for the possibility of understanding, of companionship, and perhaps even love. The plains outside remained vast and untamed, a world both beautiful and unforgiving. Tokoda and Leora were small figures against its expanse, yet within the walls of the cabin, a universe of emotions stirred. Every glance, every touch, every unspoken word carried significance, weaving a story that neither could yet fully comprehend. As evening approached, the first signs of another storm appeared on the horizon, distant clouds gathering like dark omens. Tokoda's expression hardened, his instincts alert. Leora felt the tension rise once more, a reminder that the peace they had found was fleeting. The land demanded respect, and the forces of nature were only part of the challenge they would face. And so, as the sun dipped below the horizon again, casting the plains in a dusky, uncertain light, the cabin held two souls bound by circumstance, curiosity, and the beginnings of trust. Outside, the wind whispered through the grass, carrying secrets of what was to come. Inside, Leora and Tokoda shared a quiet understanding. Their lives were intertwined now, and whatever awaited beyond the walls of the cabin, they would face it together. But danger lingered, and mystery pressed in from all sides. The storm on the horizon was a promise, and the plains were full of eyes unseen. For Leora, the world she thought she knew had shifted irrevocably. For Tokoda, the protective instinct that had guided him for years now carried a new weight, one tied not just to survival, but to the fragile, burgeoning connection he could not yet name. And in that uncertain twilight, the story of their lives stretched forward, vast and unpredictable, as endless as the plains themselves. The next morning broke cold and gray, with mist curling across the plains like the breath of some restless spirit. Leora stirred on the cot, her muscles stiff from the night, and found Tokoda already awake, standing by the small window that framed the vast rolling landscape. His eyes scanned the horizon with the precision of a hunter, noting every shadow, every movement in the distant tree line. She watched him quietly, sensing that the calm she had felt yesterday was fragile, perched on the edge of something unknown. "Who else is out there?" she asked, her voice soft but edged with worry. Tokoda did not answer immediately. He turned to her slowly, the weight of his gaze heavy but not unkind. "There are men," he said finally. "Travelers or troublemakers, I cannot yet tell. The plains are never empty, and not everyone who comes carries good intent." His words carried a warning, yet Leora sensed there was more beneath the surface, a truth he held close to protect her. Leora's mind raced. The idea that danger lurked nearby was frightening, but the thought of facing it with Tokoda beside her gave her an unfamiliar sense of courage. She remembered her late husband, the life she had tried to build alone, and how fragile it had all seemed in the face of hardship. Now with this man who was both a stranger and a protector, she felt a shift in her own spirit, as though she might finally endure whatever the land or its people might throw at her. Tokoda moved toward the hearth and rekindled the fire, the flames flickering across his sharp features. "We cannot stay here if they are coming," he said, more to himself than to her. Leora approached cautiously, curiosity mingled with fear. "Why would anyone come here?" she asked. "This land is so empty." "Empty, yes," Tokoda replied, "but it carries secrets. There are men who think wealth or power can be taken from the plains, and there are others who simply do not care who they harm along the way." His voice was calm, but his eyes betrayed a readiness for action. Leora realized that the wilderness he spoke of was not merely physical, it was moral. A place where human greed and violence could strike without warning. As they spoke, a distant sound caught Tokoda's attention, a low, rhythmic pounding that seemed out of place among the natural noises of the plains. He moved to the door and peered outside, his stance alert. Leora followed, her heart pounding as she glimpsed a group of riders approaching, dust swirling around their boots and the edges of their worn coats. Tokoda's expression hardened. He did not speak immediately, but his body was tense, ready to defend, to act, to protect. The riders came closer, a small band of men whose intentions were unclear but whose presence alone carried threat. Leora felt the tension coil in her chest, a mixture of fear, anticipation, and something she could not name yet stirring within her. Tokoda stepped forward, placing a hand on her shoulder. Stay behind me," he said, a simple command that carried trust, and she obeyed, feeling the steady weight of his protection. As the men dismounted, one of them stepped forward, a tall figure with a crooked smile and eyes that darted too quickly. "We're looking for someone," the man said, his tone casual but laced with menace. "Word is, a woman and her property are hidden out here." Tokoda's eyes narrowed, and the faintest curl of a protective snarl touched his lips. "You will find nothing here except what you deserve," he said, his voice low and steady, yet carrying a force that made even the leader of the riders hesitate. Leora felt a tremor run through her. The confrontation was immediate and dangerous, and yet, watching Tokoda, she understood something profound. Courage was not loud or reckless, it was steady, patient, and resolute. Carrie felt drawn to him in a way that scared and thrilled her, a connection deepened by the shared danger that now pressed upon them. As the men lingered at the edge of the cabin, Tokoda gestured subtly, directing Leora to move quietly to the back. She obeyed, heart pounding as he stepped forward, confronting the strangers with a presence that seemed to make the very air around him taut. "You do not belong here," he said. The men exchanged uncertain glances, a flicker of fear touching their confident postures. But fear can be fleeting, and Tokoda knew that in a land like this, cunning often outlasted brute strength. Meanwhile, Leora's thoughts raced to the life she had lived before, to the quiet evenings filled with nothing but chores and memories. Now, the land itself had changed for her, and with it, her understanding of herself. She was no longer merely a widow struggling to survive. She was part of a story that included bravery, mystery, and the presence of a man whose very existence challenged her understanding of love and safety. The leader of the riders spoke again, this time with a hint of menace. "We don't want trouble, stranger," he said, yet the crooked smile on his face betrayed his intent. Tokota's hand rested near the knife at his belt, his eyes cold and measured. "Trouble finds those who seek it," he said. "It will not find me here." The standoff stretched, tension hanging like the heavy clouds above. Inside, Leora gripped the edge of the wooden cot, her knuckles white. She wanted to speak, to offer some help, but she knew her place was behind him, and yet a part of her ached to be closer, to touch him, to share the burden of fear. She realized that this bond they were forming was not just about survival, it was about trust, reliance, and the unspoken understanding that life had brought them together for reasons neither could yet explain. The men shifted, restless, unsure of how to proceed. Tokota's reputation, whispered across the plains, preceded him. They knew instinctively that he was not a man to challenge lightly. And yet greed and arrogance have their own persistence, and the conflict was far from over. Leora sensed that the danger these strangers posed was only the first ripple of a larger threat, not just to her safety, but to the fragile connection that had begun to grow between them. As the first drops of a new storm began to fall, the air thick with the scent of rain and dust, Tokota returned briefly to Leora, his expression unreadable. "Stay close," he whispered. "Whatever comes next, we face it together." She nodded, feeling the depth of those words settle over her. She knew instinctively that life on the plains was no longer about routine or solitude. It was about vigilance, courage, and the quiet certainty that some connections are worth every risk. The riders did not leave. They lingered at the edge of the clearing, shadows against the mist, as if waiting for a weakness to reveal itself. Kota moved with careful precision, placing the cabin between them and Leora, a living barrier of protection and quiet strength. The storm intensified, the wind tearing across the plains, carrying whispers of danger that neither Leora nor Tokota could ignore. And in that moment, amidst rain, wind, and tension thick enough to taste, Leora realized something she had not yet admitted. She was no longer afraid of the unknown because she did not face it alone. Tokota's presence had shifted everything: the wilderness, the threat, even her own heart. And yet the uncertainty remained. The riders outside, the storm gathering in the distance, and the vast, untamed plains, all promised challenges that would test every ounce of courage, every instinct, and every fragile bond that was forming within the small cabin. The conflict had begun in earnest, and the consequences were yet unseen.
Ow.
Every glance, every whispered command, every movement carried weight. Leora and Tokota were bound together now, not by chance alone, but by the forces of the land, the inevitability of danger, and the quiet, relentless pull of something neither had expected. Outside, the plains waited, full of eyes unseen and paths untaken, and within the cabin, two lives braced for the storm that would shape them both in ways they could not yet imagine. The storm had grown fierce, slashing rain against the cabin with a violence that seemed to shake the very timbers. Leora pressed herself against the wall, shivering, as the wind howled like a chorus of lost souls across the plains. Tokota moved with quiet urgency, securing the shutters and stacking wood for the fire, his eyes constantly flicking to the shadows outside. Every snap of a branch, every distant rumble of thunder, every movement in the fogged landscape felt like a signal of danger inching closer. Leora's fingers grazed the rough edge of the wooden table, her heart racing as she watched him. There was something about the way he moved, calm, controlled, yet ready to spring into action that made her chest tighten. She realized that she had come to rely on him in ways she hadn't expected, that his presence had become a tether anchoring her amidst fear and uncertainty. And yet beneath the trust, there was a tension, a spark, silent acknowledgement of something more between them, fragile and unspoken. The riders had not returned, but Tokota's instincts told him they were still out there, waiting for the right moment. He spoke little, but his words carried weight when he did. "They are clever," he murmured, "and cruel. They do not move without reason. Tonight we must be ready for anything." Leora nodded, trying to steel herself, though the pounding of the storm and the distant howls of coyotes made her feel small and vulnerable in the vast wilderness. Hours passed with the storm raging around them, and Leora watched as Tokota moved through the cabin with a grace that belied his size and strength. Each movement was deliberate, precise, as if he were conducting some silent battle with the wind and rain themselves. Her heart ached with a mixture of admiration and longing. She wanted to speak, to ask about his life, about the stories that must lie behind those dark, unreadable eyes. But every time she opened her mouth, the sound of the storm or the tension in the air silenced her. Suddenly, a loud crash against the cabin door made her startle. Tokoda was at her side in an instant, his hand on hers, steadying her. "Stay behind me," he said, his voice a low growl that carried authority without anger. She obeyed, heart hammering as he moved to confront the threat.
Outside.
The shadows shifted, and in the flickering firelight through the small window, she glimpsed shapes moving through the rain, figures she could not fully discern. One of the riders had returned, braving the storm, his coat soaked and plastered to his frame. He leaned against the door, a cruel smile spreading across his face as he rapped a heavy knuckle against the wood. "We know you're in there," he called. "You cannot hide forever." Tokoda's eyes narrowed, dark and dangerous. "You will leave, or you will find more than you bargained for," he said, voice steady. Carrying a calm menace that seemed to slice through the storm, Leora felt a shiver run down her spine. She'd never seen a man command a situation with such quiet power. Fear was still present, gnawing at her chest. But she also felt an odd thrill, an exhilaration born of the knowledge that Tokoda would not let harm come to her. And in that moment she realized just how deeply she had begun to care, how entwined her life had become with his, in ways she could not yet name. The rider slammed his fist against the door again, and Tokoda moved with a swiftness that belied his size, blocking the entry with a single motion. Leora gasped, instinctively reaching for him, feeling the pulse of danger vibrating through his presence. The storm outside seemed to mirror the storm in the cabin, the tension, the uncertainty, the rising anticipation of confrontation. Every shadow, every gust of wind, every distant howl felt amplified, as if the land itself was holding its breath for what was about to happen. Tokoda's hand brushed against Leora's, deliberate yet fleeting, grounding her in the moment. She felt a jolt at the touch, a spark that made her heart race faster than the pounding rain. "Trust me," he whispered, and she nodded, knowing she had no choice, but also knowing she wanted to. Their connection was palpable, silent but undeniable. A thread of intimacy woven into the life-and-death tension surrounding them. The rider's voice rose, calling for his companions, but the storm masked the sound. Tokoda moved to the door again, listening, every muscle taut, every sense alive. Leora's stomach tightened as she watched him, realizing that the danger outside was only part of the test. The true trial lay in the unknown, in what the riders might do next, in what the storm might unleash. Yet in the intensity, in the closeness, in the shared fear, she felt a strange exhilaration, a recognition that this moment, though terrifying, was also alive with possibility. The hours dragged on, the storm refusing to abate, and the tension inside the cabin built like coiled lightning. Leora caught herself watching Tokoda, noticing the subtle way his jaw tightened when he listened, the way his eyes darkened as he anticipated movement beyond the walls. She realized that he was not just protecting her body, but guarding the fragile bond that had begun to form between them, a connection neither of them fully understood yet, but both sensed with growing intensity. Suddenly, a loud crash came from the back of the cabin. Tokoda spun, instincts kicking in, and Leora found herself pressed against the wall as he moved to confront the unseen threat. The storm raged, thunder shaking the cabin, rain lashing against the windows. The world outside had become a blur of shadows and noise, and inside, the air was thick with anticipation. Leora's pulse pounded, her breath quickening, as she realized that whatever came next could change everything. The riders were no longer simply a distant threat. They were at the edge of the cabin, testing, probing, waiting for weakness. Da's eyes met hers for a fleeting moment, a silent acknowledgement of the danger and of the bond that had grown between them. He moved with deliberate care, a shadow in the flickering light. And Leora felt a surge of something she could not name. Fear, certainly, but also a deep, aching connection, a sense that their lives were entwined in ways that the storm outside mirrored in intensity. Lightning flashed, illuminating the room in stark white, and for a moment, she saw him as if carved from the very wilderness, strong, fearless, and utterly devoted. She wanted to speak, to reach him, to tell him she trusted him, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she held her breath, waiting, watching, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down like the storm itself. The rider's voice rose again, more forceful this time, a challenge carried on the wind. Dakota's response was a low, calm murmur, almost a warning, almost a promise. Tonight, you will learn why some lands are not to be crossed, and why some bonds are not to be broken. The words were simple, yet they carried the power of a man who knew his world and his responsibilities within it. Leora felt a shiver run through her, not from the cold, but from the intensity, the intimacy, the undeniable truth that her life had changed irreversibly in the presence of this man. And then, in the flicker of firelight and storm shadows, Leora realized the full weight of what lay ahead. The storm, the riders, the endless plains, they were all forces beyond her control. But in Takota's presence, she found courage she had never known. In the silent touch of his hand, in the strength of his body between her and danger, she felt the stirrings of hope, trust, and something far deeper love, perhaps, or the promise of it. Outside, the storm raged. Inside, the tension crackled like lightning, a living force that bound them together. And in that moment, as rain pelted the roof and shadows danced along the walls, Leora and Dakota faced the precipice of change. A moment before the climax of their trial, where courage, trust, and the fragile promise of connection would collide with the dangers of the plains in ways neither could yet imagine. Every heartbeat, every glance, every breath carried the weight of anticipation. The storm would not last forever, but its lesson was clear. Life on the plains demanded vigilance, courage, and a willingness to trust. And for Leora, for Dakota, for the bond forming between them, the night ahead promised revelations, challenges, and the possibility of a life neither had dared to hope for. The storm finally broke as dawn crept over the horizon, painting the plains in soft gold and silver. The cabin, battered by wind and rain, stood as a testament to endurance, its walls sheltering to souls who had faced the night together. Leora emerged from the corner where she had watched Dakota stand vigilant. Her heart still pounding from the tension, yet lighter now in the calm of morning. She saw him moving among the scattered firewood, his hands steady, his expression thoughtful, but softening with relief. The riders had retreated, their intentions foiled by Dakota's skill and vigilance. He had outmaneuvered them in the storm, using the land to his advantage, turning the plains into both shield and weapon. Leora's admiration for him deepened as she watched him, realizing that this man's courage was not only physical, but also quiet, patient, and unwavering. He had risked himself without hesitation, driven by instinct and something far deeper, a sense of honor and protection that extended beyond mere survival. "Are you hurt?" Leora asked, moving closer. Her voice trembled slightly, though her eyes reflected warmth and relief. Dakota turned, meeting her gaze, and for a moment the world seemed still. "No," he said quietly. "The storm tests, but it does not break me. Neither will it break you." His words carried weight, not just of experience, but of reassurance. And Leora felt herself leaning toward him, drawn by the bond forged in fear, trust, and shared trials. The night's events had left their mark, and as they began to survey the cabin for damage, the reality of the plains returned in small details: the broken shutters, the scattered wood, the mud that clung stubbornly to the floors. Yet even in the aftermath, there was beauty in the resilience of the place and the strength of the two who had weathered the storm. Leora realized that this land, harsh and unforgiving, had also become a witness to courage, to trust, and to the subtle beginnings of love. Dakota paused, looking out across the misted plains. "These lands are unforgiving," he said softly. "But they also teach lessons no town ever could. You have learned one already. Strength comes not just from muscle, but from heart." Leora's chest swelled with emotion. She had thought herself alone, fragile, and unworthy of protection. Yet here, in the quiet after the storm, she understood that her spirit had endured, that she had faced fear and survived, and that she was capable of love and trust, even after loss. As the morning light grew stronger, the cabin seemed warmer, brighter, and more alive. Dakota returned inside, bringing with him the faint scent of the wet earth and pine from the plains. Leora watched him, noticing the subtle way his eyes softened when they met hers, the gentle line of his jaw, the quiet strength in his posture. There was a tenderness now between them that had been absent before, a connection born not from words, but from shared trials, from moments of silence, and from the knowledge that they had relied on one another when the world seemed most uncertain. "We should rebuild," Dakota said, his voice practical but carrying a hint of warmth. "Not just the cabin, but everything. Your home, this land. It is yours to protect as much as mine to defend." Leora nodded, a smile breaking across her face. She felt a spark of hope she had not known in years. The plains, once intimidating and lonely, now felt alive with possibility, with promise, and with the quiet magic of connection. As they worked together, stacking wood, repairing shutters, and tending to the small garden that had survived the storm, the conversation turned to their lives, their pasts, and the paths that had brought them here. Dakota spoke of his Apache heritage, of lessons learned in the wilderness, and of the responsibility he felt to protect those who could not protect themselves. Leora shared fragments of her life before the storm, the loss, the struggle, and the quiet longing that had defined her days. Each story, each confession, drew them closer, weaving their lives together like the threads of a tapestry shaped by the land itself. By mid-morning, the cabin stood repaired, a symbol of resilience and new beginnings. Leora paused, brushing a strand of damp hair from her face, and looked at Dakota. "I never imagined I could feel this. Safe, not just from the storm, but from the world itself." Dakota's gaze met hers, dark and steady, carrying a depth of feeling he had not yet spoken aloud. "Safety is not given," he said softly. "It is earned, shared, and sometimes it is found in the heart of another." There was a long silence, filled only by the sound of the wind over the plains and the faint chirping of birds returning after the storm. Leora felt a warmth spread through her chest, a gentle certainty that life, though harsh, could also be beautiful, filled with trust, courage, and the promise of love. She realized that the man before her had become more than a protector. He had become a companion, a partner in the truest sense, someone whose presence made the world feel less lonely, less daunting, and infinitely more alive. The riders were gone, their threat removed by Dakota's cunning and skill, but the lessons remained. Leora understood now that danger would always exist on the plains, that life would demand courage and vigilance. Yet she also understood that she was not alone, that connection could be found even in the harshest places, and that love could grow where trust was nurtured and shared. The plains, wide and endless, were no longer simply a place of survival. They were a canvas for new beginnings. As the sun climbed higher, casting light across the rebuilt cabin and the rolling plains beyond, Dakota and Leora paused to take in the view. The storm had passed, leaving the air fresh and sweet, the ground soaked and fertile. Birds flitted between trees and the distant mountains glimmered in the sunlight. Leora turned to him, a soft smile on her lips, and felt a surge of gratitude and hope. "Thank you," she said simply, "for everything, for being here." Dakota's expression softened, and for a moment, the rugged warrior was simply a man, vulnerable in the presence of the woman he had come to care for. "It was not just for you," he said quietly. "It was for us. This place, this life, this connection we share. We protect what we love and we survive together." Leora reached for his hand, feeling the warmth and strength in his touch. Their fingers intertwined, simple yet profound, and in that gesture they acknowledged everything unspoken between them, the trust, the bond, the promise of a shared future. The plains stretched endlessly before them, a land of challenge and beauty, danger and possibility. Leora felt a quiet certainty settle within her. Life would not always be easy, storms would come and threats would arise, but she would no longer face them alone. Dakota's presence, his courage, his care, had transformed her world, turning fear into trust, loneliness into companionship, and uncertainty into hope. They stood together, side by side, watching the wind ripple through the grass, feeling the pulse of the land beneath their feet. The storm had passed, the riders were gone, and the cabin, small and strong, stood as a testament to their resilience. Leora knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, strengthened by trust, courage, and the quiet power of love that had blossomed in the shadow of danger. And as the sun rose fully over the plains, painting the world in gold and warmth, Leora and Takoda shared a glance that needed no words. Their lives, once separate and uncertain, were now intertwined. The storm had tested them, the plains had challenged them, and the dangers of the frontier had pushed them to the edge. But in the quiet aftermath, they had found not just survival, but joy, connection, and the promise of a life shared in trust, courage, and love. The cabin, the plains, the wind, and the sun all seemed to whisper the same truth. Life was harsh, but with courage and connection, it could also be beautiful. And in that beauty, Leora and Takoda found the beginning of a story neither had dared hope for, a story of resilience, romance, and the enduring power of the human spirit in the heart of the wild American frontier. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to our channel. Your support means a lot and gives us the courage to create even more exciting tales.